لأجلك يا مدينة الصلاة أصلي، لأجلك يا بهية المساكن، يا زهرة المدائن، يا قدس يا قدس يا قدس يا مدينة الصلاة أصلي. عيوننا إليك ترحل كل يوم، ترحل كل يوم، تدور في أروقة المعابد، تعانق الكنائس القديمة، وتمسح الحزن عن المساجد. يا ليلة الإسراء، يا درب من مروا إلى السماء، عيوننا إليك ترحل كل يوم، وإنني أصلي. الطفل في المغارة وأمه مريم وجهان يبكيان. الطفل في المغارة وأمه مريم وجهان يبكيان، يبكيان لأجل من تشردوا، لأجل أطفال بلا منازل، لأجل من دافع واستشهد في المداخل، واستشهد السلام في وطن السلام، وسقط العدل على المداخل. سقط العدل، سقط العدل.
Okay, thank you all for joining. So that video, can anyone either just say it out loud or, yeah, thank you. I know the captions I realized too. Oh wait, I see it in the comments. Who is that? Oh yeah, I know you're, okay, you said you can't unmute maybe. So yes, that is Feiruz. Yes, and many people would call her a queen.
Why is this not working?
Sorry? Okay. So this was a song by Feiruz. Feiruz is a very, very famous singer in the Arab world. She was actually Lebanese and she was Christian. And she has beautiful, beautiful songs. I encourage you to listen to this and to any of her other songs. And this was actually called Zahrat al-Mada'in, which translates to Flower of the Cities. And so I know, like Halima commented, that it's the unwavering yearning and passion for our land, most definitely. But this particular song is very interesting because if you remember our topic last week, we were talking, we got up to 1967 Naksa. So this song was a response to the Naksa, and the expulsion of Palestinians from occupied Palestine in 67. So if you paid attention to the lyrics at the bottom, and yes, I didn't remember at the beginning, but I did remember the captions. She's talking about Jerusalem in particular and is calling for its liberation. And yes, Manar, this is also a very important thing to note is that this idea, there's this long historical myth of part of the issue in Palestine is religion, which is absolutely false. And this is a perfect example of that. Like Minaj said, that the people were united, and this just shows the deep relationships between the Muslim and the Christian population, and it had nothing to do with religion. They were unified and supported each other. Thanks, Manal. So for today, I couldn't play all of it, but definitely listen to that song. It's beautiful. Okay, so today's class. Today's class is going to be a little bit more lecture heavy like last time, but we'll try to break it up a little bit as much as we can. So today we're talking about important dates in Palestine's history, part 2. So post 1967 to the present. So we're actually, it's crazy to think, but we're already halfway through our class. This is the 4th class. And then this first class was mostly like PAC centered, but starting next week and on, we'll always have guest speakers that will be joining us as well. So today, if Lemmy, you don't mind, unless you put it already, if we can put the link to the mid-course survey in the chat. This is on Google Classroom, and we'll remind you again next week. Our surveys really help. We really appreciate the feedback because it's how we learn for next time and how to change and how to adjust. So we really appreciate hearing from all of you guys, and what your thoughts are in the class and how we can make it better and make any changes. In addition, I didn't put it here, but we also have posted on Google Classroom a document for testimonials. So if you can, this again also really helps us. If you are really excited about the class, which we hope you all are, and are willing to give us a feedback, a testimonial, you just record yourself for 30 seconds to a minute telling us about this class and sharing it with others so that in the future we can use it for promotional material. I'm looking at our marketing director right now as I say this. So today's class, we're going to be talking again, Palestine history, and then we're going to end off with putting Gaza in context and hopefully have enough time for some questions and discussion. This is just the QR code for our mid-course survey. If anyone wants to go ahead and screenshot it and answer it either now or after we're done, that would be great. So that's definitely the link should be in the chat too, Lemia. Thank you. Okay, so today we're talking about the aftermath of the Naksa. So we're picking up from after the Naksa. So review. What was the Naksa? Very briefly. And we'll look at the chat. Like a pop quiz. Okay. So the Naksa was the War of 1960s after the War of 1967. So we'll actually review it a little bit now, because I know again we ended at a lot. So basically the Naksa ended with it was a 6-day war. The Arab countries, so we'll talk a little bit about a little more detail than what we talked about last time, united to defeat Israel, and within 6 days, the Israel army defeated the Arab the Arab front, and it actually resulted in further occupation of Palestine. So right here, so we talk, and here we're going to talk about how it affected the other fronts of the countries that were involved. So in terms of the Egyptian front, 85% of the Egyptian Air Force was destroyed. Within 2 days, they occupied the Sinai and then the Suez. And it talks here, we talked a little bit last time in terms of like what was the big mistake, and it was that the Israeli army really had much more power in terms of military and support than all the Arab armies combined. They tried. They were out they were not, it wasn't an equal fight, and they lost very quickly. So if you want to talk like very specifics, so for the Egyptians, they weren't organized, the soldiers had deserted, and many were captured, and then the army was left devastated. In terms of the Egyptian front, the Egyptian army, I'm sorry, the Jordan front, the Jordanian army had to withdraw, and it was actually there's some kind, I don't want to speak specifics, but there was comments saying before that maybe like the Jordanian army retreated beforehand, because they may have predicted that they were going to lose, and this actually resulted in the destruction of the Jordanian military airports and their air force. Right. So again, we have a lot to cover today, so it's going to be a little bit of jumping here. So the aftermath of the Naksa was more of occupation. So like the song that Feiruz sang is, they lost, basically we lost a lot more of Palestine in the 1967 occupation of the Naksa. So I wanted to, we did give you a few recommendations. I think if you want to go further in detail in those, we do really encourage you to read that. So after, so I wanted to pull up, actually didn't put it here. So we ended it in our last PowerPoint. I would go back and review it. I was going to show you the land loss map, but I don't think we put it here. So after 1967, that's when the West Bank was occupied and East Jerusalem was occupied, and then parts of Syria were occupied as well. And then, so after post 1967, there was a rise in Palestinian unified resistance. So if you want to keep it to try to bridge the gap between the end of that and the rise of post-war Palestinian armed resistance, essentially many Palestinian groups and leaders realized that many of the Arab countries are not going to save them. They realized, okay, so we need to fight for ourselves, and started to organize, and they started to turn many of them to armed resistance. So key figures of post-war Palestinian armed resistance was Yasser Arafat. Just a fun note, many people know him because he was a very prominent leader, obviously, and he was a big player in Palestine's history. But something not everyone knows is that his personal history is unclear, but it's actually very likely that he was from Gaza. So at this time, Yasser Arafat moved to unify Palestinians through the Fatah Party, and he was trying to organize for a united front so the Palestinians can take responsibility for their own future. And this is where we saw a rise in Palestinian nationalism. Another key figure was George Habash, who many called Al-Hakim, because he was a doctor first, so physically he was a doctor, but also because he was so wise, and he was a big player at this time as well. So again, at this time, this is when people were trying to move for a Palestinian United Front, not the Arabs, but Palestinians specifically, and this was as a result of what happened after the 1967 Naksa. They turned to the armed struggle for their liberation. The key organizations were the Fatah Party. There was also the PFLP, but Fatah remained stronger throughout, and later also Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and a few other factions that are just more minor. And a lot of the slogans and the ideas at this time was this new faith in the Palestinian resistance. Okay, so a few major landmark dates was the Battle of Karama, Black September, and Land Day at this time. So these you can kind of coordinate and put together as Palestinian victories and different moments of mobilization. So in 1968, again, we see the rise in the Palestinian armed resistance and defense against Israel. The Karama battle was in 1968, and this is when Palestinians defeated the Israeli army, which was very important, I think, in rejuvenating Palestinian resistance because it was a victory post the 1967 defeat. And it actually attracted both intellectuals and volunteers from across the Arab world to the Palestinian struggle. And this was a huge victory because of this in different ways. Then in 1967, there was what's called the Key Agreement. Essentially, there was a split in the PFLP and the Democratic Front, and the PFLP adopted more Marxist thought. And this then saw the Key Agreement, which regulated the resistance operations from Lebanon because much of the resistance was operating from Lebanon post the Israeli 1967 invasion. Yes, I'm doing a class.
Jim stole my computer.
Okay. And then in 1973, actually before that, in 1970, actually, I'm going to skip that. So in 1973, we then saw the 10-point program. This was basically a strategy to establish Palestinian Authority on any liberated part of Palestine where they could. So again, we see more of Palestinians trying to take control and regain control against Israel. So then we had Black September. The context of Black September was after the 1967 war. Palestinian resistance groups, particularly the PLO, operated from Jordan at this time. I know I said much was in Lebanon, but at this time they were in Jordan. And this was a challenge to both Israel and the Jordanian monarchy. And that's why later they no longer operate in Jordan. So the event of Black September was it was in September 1970, and it was an armed conflict between the Jordanian army and Palestinian resistance groups, and it resulted in the suppression of the PLO. And then in 1971, because of this, they were expelled from Jordan. So the resistance was no longer in Jordan. The impact of this was, at the time, the monarchy was King Hussein, so they were afraid of destabilizing the monarchy, and then it resulted in their expulsion. The impact of this was that the Palestinian resistance was then relocated, and their operations were centralized in Lebanon. But another impact of this was that it deepened the divisions between the Arab regimes and the Palestinian factions. And actually the term Black September was adopted by a Palestinian militant group later, which was infamous for a 1972 Munich Olympics attack. The next major event at this time was Land Day, and this was in March 30th, 1976. So this was the first major protest by Palestinian citizens of Israel against the land confiscation policies that resulted post-1967. So that's, if you remember, we talked last week, is when you start to see the illegal settlements grow. So at the time, Israeli authorities announced plans to expropriate thousands of acres of Palestinian land in the Jalili and confiscate the land. Yes.
Mama.
Okay. So the event that resulted, the actual event of Land Day, no.
There's something I need to tell your class.
No, you can't tell them. Okay, so the result of the actual event was March 30th, and resulted in general strikes and protests. And it resulted in the death of 6 Palestinians, hundreds that were injured, and then many that were also arrested. And Land Day became a symbol of Palestinian resistance to Israeli land theft and oppression. And it actually marked the first collective action by Palestinians within Israel since 1948. And Land Day is now commemorated annually by Palestinians worldwide. We haven't had it. I don't know when, if Rani wants to chime in, but at PAC we actually had Land Day commemorations before, and this happens worldwide and in Palestine annually to this day.
Mama. No, can I tell your class thing?
No.
No, it's happy.
No. Okay. The next major.
Israel, stop fighting.
He's happy that there's a ceasefire. Go ahead, Rania.
I was gonna say, do you want me to jump in for a second? So yeah, so Land Day is something that's commemorated in several different ways. At PAC, we had some events where we were commemorating the significance of land. As we said before, and we're gonna get into more and more, is the symbol of land. It's not only a symbol, but it's also something that you see, and it's like intergenerational. So you see it throughout many generations. It's something that's passed down, it's something that's celebrated, it's something that's very personal, and it's something that's like being constantly attacked by Israeli settlements and by Israeli attacks. Okay, very good. I love Tamim. Tamim is our honorary PAC employee.
So next is the 1982 Lebanon War. So this began as an Israeli invasion of Lebanon. And this is really important to bring us to today, the context of today, because if you weren't aware, as the genocide on Gaza was continuing, Israel was also attacking Lebanon, and actually only a few days ago. So there was a ceasefire agreement where they were supposed to withdraw from Lebanon, but up until a few days ago, that was their essentially the deadline for Israel to leave, and they didn't. And it's again, I think it's really important to see how cyclical all of this is. It's not just a moment in time, and it's not just our history, but all of it is happening from then to our present. It's all very real for us. So to go back to 1982, this began as an Israeli invasion of Lebanon. It was a 3-month massacre, and just to sum it up, was the point of this was to debilitate the PLO, who was operating from Lebanon, and turn the Lebanese civil war in favor of Israel and Israel's right-wing allies. This led to the Israeli occupation of many parts of southern Lebanon, and the occupation of that time lasted until 2000. So there were multiple times, not just what happened this past year, that Israel also invaded Lebanon. And this was a massive setback for the PLO, for Yasser Arafat's leadership, and it forced them to leave Lebanon. And they were, many of the resistance was then exiled, and they had to establish new headquarters in Tunis. And this was a turning point essentially because not only for Israel's attack on Lebanon, but also for the resistance movement and that they were forced out. One major massacre that was part of the 1982 Lebanon War was the Sabra and Shatila massacre. This happened, it was one of the worst consequences of the war. I'm not going to play it just again because of time, because there's so much, but if you check out PAC's reel, Lami, if you can put that link in the comments. We have a reel actually of an interview with one of our community members who survived the Sabra and Shatila massacre, so you can hear the first-hand account of that. And then we also have, I'm gonna play this one instead. So this is a video. Sabra and Shatila it's really important. I'm gonna play the video, and then we could discuss a little bit about why, and again, the effects of it are seen until today.
I'm one of the survivors from Sabra and Shatila massacre, which happened in 1982. I lost my whole family.
Between September 16 and 18, 1982, people in Beirut's Sabra and Shatila refugee camps were massacred. Estimates vary, but about 2,000 Palestinian refugees, mostly women, children and the elderly, were killed. The attack took place during Lebanon's civil war, a few months after Israel's invasion of the country.
فأنا كنت متخبي بين النسوان. لأنه كان كمية كبيرة من النسوان والأطفال اللي كانوا يفوق 200 بارة وطفل. فأنا بيناتهم متخبي وماشي وماسك إيد أخوي وهيك. فناس بيقتلونا قدام المحلات، محل ما كان في تجمع كبير للقتلة هونيك وشفناهم.
The massacre was committed as revenge for the assassination of Bashir Gemayel, the leader of the Phalangists. The Lebanese Maronite Christian Phalangist militia wrongly blamed the Palestinians for the assassination and murdered hundreds while the Israeli army was accused of standing by. Boys older than 15 were separated from their families and lined up against walls to be shot. The examination of other corpses, including women and children, showed signs that they were shot at point-blank range. Robert Fisk, one of the first journalists to arrive at the scene, described the events as a war crime. In December 1982, the United Nations General Assembly condemned the massacre as genocide. An independent commission was then chaired by Sean McBride, a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. The commission agreed with calling what happened a genocide and accused Israeli authorities and the army of being responsible in the massacres and other killings that took place in Sabra and Shatila. The McBride Commission published its findings in 1983. That year, Israel's own Khan Commission found Israel responsible, although indirectly. The commission said Ariel Sharon bore personal responsibility and should be dismissed as defense minister. Sharon reluctantly resigned, but remained in the cabinet. He would later go on to become prime minister.
We asked for the trial of these criminals, and no one accepted that time. Now we hope that all of them, beginning by Mr. Sharon, but all the generals, all the responsibles of the killing of the Palestinians and the Arab civilians, the peacemakers of the Israeli Arabs, even in Mr. Sharon and his surrounding, to be by law, by international criminal law, be judged as the criminals against humanity, against the independence of the people.
In 2001, the survivors of the massacre and relatives of the victims filed a lawsuit in Belgium against Ariel Sharon, the Israeli defense minister during the massacre. Belgian law allows foreigners to be prosecuted for war crimes regardless of where they were committed. Sharon's lawyers won an injunction and the inquiry was suspended. An appeals court ruled that the case was inadmissible in June 2002, the Belgian judges saying that a case could not proceed against a person who was not in Belgium. By then, Sharon had become the Prime Minister of Israel, which gave him immunity against prosecution. And when the International Criminal Court was established in The Hague in 1998, the ICC couldn't try anyone for the massacre because when it was established, it was decided that it wouldn't hear cases predating July 1, 2002. Every year, Palestinians fill the streets of their hometowns to commemorate the lives lost during the 1982 massacre. After 33 years, they remember the victims of Sabra and Shatila and continue to demand trials for those they believe have so far gotten away with murder.
So once again, everything that happens is so cyclical. You can see all the connections from then until today. So the Sabra and Shatila massacre is known as one of the darkest days for the Palestinian resistance. They massacred Palestinians in refugee camps and in the poorest of neighborhoods. And it was a horrific number of women and children in particular that were killed that day. And it set a new precedent in terms of the violence that Israel was able to commit. It's also very symbolic because Palestinian resistance had to move out of Lebanon, but they gained more recognition and awareness of what was happening from this massacre in the rest of the world. And it also was very significant because it showed how far Israel could go and how much Israel's aggression extended beyond Palestine because it reached these camps and because of the devastation and the violence that they were able to commit. There's also we didn't put it here, but if you look it up, it should be on Netflix. I'll check if they still have it and link it otherwise. There's also a really powerful documentary about the Sabra and Shatila camps today. So the camps, even until today, you see the descendants of those that live there and the way that the refugee camps are, which we talked a little bit about last time. They have the very poor conditions. The families still remember, and they like it said in the video, they're still waiting for the justice that they weren't given. So to go back to the Israeli occupation, so post 67 and then on, the occupation after the 1967 war went in kind of phases. So in the 67 to the 70s is when we start to see a lot of suppression and actions that Israel takes that you see again until this day. So for example, they started immediate curfews and tracking Palestinians via their ID cards at this time. And then there's also this ID system is used until today to suppress Palestinians. Then there's also infrastructure control. So there were roads connecting the West Bank and Gaza to Israel. So this is when you saw the division and the separation from the West Bank and Gaza. So if you I don't know if we talked about this last time or if this is someone I was talking about this with someone else, but if you look at the diagram, and you see like where the West Bank is and then where Gaza is, there's a big separation. Could anyone just kind of throw out an idea of why? So like they said, you're gonna only have this certain piece of land. Why is it completely separate? Like why not connect it? Why not just leave an even split? Any guesses?
I'm guessing so that people aren't actively united, especially resistance movements. Yeah, like Alex said, a divide and conquer method.
Yeah, exactly, Alex and Amanat. Yes. Okay, we didn't. So I was talking about it with someone. Sorry, guys. Okay. So yeah, it's a very deliberate divide and conquer method. Like literally, we're going to physically separate you and separate the people so that they're weakened. And then we saw the first settlement was actually in 1968, and it was the Yalom plan. And it created alarm-based settlements along the borders, and then we again continue to see the rise in settlements and the growth of settlements until this day. 2024, this past year, this past year saw the highest land confiscation by Israel in the West Bank than it's been in the past 20 years. So this is when it started, but today we're seeing it just continue to grow and grow. And this is also when you saw an increase in suppression in terms of politics. So there was a ban on any kind of Palestinian political activity, any kind of media, and then you also had the annexation of Jerusalem. So it's something what some people call the start of a liberal occupation. So that they started to occupy, it was the first period of occupation where they wanted to really have full control over Palestine in a way that Israel claimed like it's a liberal occupation because they could still live, but the reality was their movement and their daily life was affected so much. It's impossible not to live without the full occupation, and not to see the full effects of it in every way. And then again to extend this.
There were some questions in the chat
Oh,
about
yeah.
dividing and conquer and what do we mean by alarm based?
Okay, thank you, Rania. So with divide and conquer, so the idea behind, and I'll go back to the I'll go back to that slide. So when we say the divide and conquer, so if you see like we said, West Bank is on one section and Gaza is on one section, it really like in all ways completely divided the Palestinians. So each area was on its own. The even if you look at today, the Gaza's government and the West Banks, the way that they're controlled is completely separate. The people don't see each other. So there's many people from Gaza that have never, even if they've been allowed to travel outside of Gaza before with the special permits and everything they have to do to be able to do that, they're not allowed to go to the West Bank. Same for Palestinians in the West Bank, they can't go to Gaza. So there's a complete disconnect between the people. So they're not, the idea is that we're going to keep you divided in every way. So there's no way for unity, because the more united a people are, the more they're able to overthrow or fight back against our oppressor. Ronnie always explains this very well, so if you want to jump in, Ronnie.
I think you did a really great job. I think it's just the idea of like not only is it physically divided, but then when we get into like even in the West Bank a little bit more, there's several different identification differences. Do you have the Jerusalem identification? Do you have the West Bank identification? Do you have the Gaza identification? Do you have the Arab Israeli or Palestinians living within Israel's borders identification? And each of these dictate how far you can move and what laws govern you. So it's also in a way of like not only physically dividing the people, but it's also through the laws and the way that they live their daily lives, that it's very separate. So one instance is right now we know that Gaza is one of the largest open air prisons in the sense that it's was fully sieged and there's a full blockade around it. Some videos that I've been seeing recently because of the checkpoints that were put after this recent genocide, a lot of them were saying, oh, is this how the Palestinians of the West Bank feel? Because Palestinians in the West Bank are living under military occupation and military law where they have to face several checkpoints, while Palestinians in Jerusalem have a completely different, set of rules that they have to follow. While Palestinians living in 1948 or modern day Israel also have a lot of different rules they have to follow. So the idea is that each of these people are kind of having different lived experiences. So the idea of a Palestinian is being divided in different ways. And then you have the Palestinians that are living in the diaspora. You have the Palestinians living in refugee camps. You have the Palestinians living in refugee camps within the West Bank. You have the Palestinians living in refugee camps outside of Palestine. So there's so many different realities of what it means to be Palestinian that it's this idea of continuously dividing people and dividing the Palestinians.
Thank you, Rania. And then for the question about the alarm-based settlements, it's just that like literally they have high security around the settlements. So like they literally have like alarms around the settlements, many that were established then, and I think until today, like that Palestinians basically to separate Palestinians from there. And I don't think it's as important as the fact that they have the alarms, but the fact that the settlements are there by UN. Even so after the occupation, UN law dictates that Israel is not allowed to be expanding their settlements and expanding on the land that they take from Palestinians, but they did so right after the Nakba, and they continue to do so until today. Okay, so other ways that so other ways of the occupation was different control tactics that Rania just spoke about actually now, was the confiscation of basic resources. So Israel completely controls the water resources of Palestinians. It controls, so if you, a lot of homes, if you see like the tops of them, they have they have these tanks, and the reason is because Palestinians only get they don't have a water system the same way that Israeli settlers are given within Israel. They have to use these tanks, and they have to like get the water, fill the water, and then they only get them at a certain times. So when I'll just talk about like my firsthand experience. When I grew up, we would go visit home, and there were certain days that we had water and certain that we didn't. The hot water was like basically never had. You'd have to fill it up, and then you'd have to wait until the tank was full to be able to use them. And then if your tank is running low and it's not the day for you to get your water refilled, then you either you have to go get from like a nearby, we had to get from like a nearby well, or you have to just conserve your water. And this is all not because we don't have water in the area, but because we don't have a system, because Israel doesn't give it. Something else that we were talking about recently in a talk when Mehdi Sabah came was the trash system. Palestinians are not, there's no trash system. So what many do is it has to be community, even though like, there are the resources for this, but they're not given that, and they're not allowed to have it. So you'd have to literally gather your trash and burn it, or the people in the community would gather and clean it up themselves. Palestinians are also prohibited from accessing borders and the ports. And then what this talks about with the honeymoon phase was at the beginning, the idea was that it was supposed to be that they're supposed to get equal access and they're supposed to get, equal rights. But as we saw then, and as we saw now in the long-term impact, that didn't happen. Palestinian economy is very restricted. Israel purposefully wanted and wants Palestinians to remain reliant on them, on Israel, so that there's a dependency there. And again, the effects of that are seen until today. So that Palestinians can't be self-reliant, and then they can't be free from the oppressor. And these are just some diagrams that talk a little bit about that. So this is from the West Bank. This is in Jerusalem. Rania, yes.
I just wanted to add one thing. Anyone who's been to the West Bank, actually, what I always tell people is as you're driving on the main roads that Israel has taken over, so a lot of the main roads are, Israeli occupied, you can literally tell a Palestinian city from a settlement because the settlements Though they're both in the West Bank, they're both right next to each other. The settlements will have no water tanks because the water will be constantly flowing. And sometimes they even have like huge community pools and all this different stuff. While, you know, the Palestinian villages and cities will have tanks on top because of what Besma was saying in terms of conserving water. So it's not like something that, you know, it's clear as day and you can clearly see it, where as you're driving, you can see the settlements have. And then when you get into certain areas, they even control the natural water resources. So like what Bess was saying about wells, there's a huge movement of Israeli settlers moving towards these natural water and taking natural water sources and taking them over. So for example, one of the times I went to Jericho, which is Ariha in Arabic, we went there and it was an area, we were talking about the differences in area A, B, and C, which we'll talk about. And basically there was a river that was a natural water source that just randomly it was like at least 3 days during the week, an Israeli settler group would come and just decide that they needed to have a family gathering, have whatever, a gathering in that water source. And it was pointed out to us that they have several water sources. There's several, you know, whether it be through pools or through constant water that they have in their settlements, or even that they've confiscated other water sources, but they had to come here because they made a point. So they would come, they bring the Israeli flag, and then the Israeli military would come protect them. So they would come around them completely. And so Palestinians, that's how many, you know, Palestinians ended up losing a lot of these places. And if you read Ahad Tamimi's book, she also discusses this. That's actually how in her village, that's how a lot of the Friday demonstrations started, because it was around a water source. They had like a well. So it was a water source that they were trying to protect that became more and more dangerous to get to because the Israeli military would come and protect it. And it would protect the settlers that were coming to confiscate it.
Seeing any questions in the chat. Yeah, so when it comes, so someone said like in Gaza, so it's a little different in Gaza and the West Bank, but in Gaza, Rani mentioned it before, it's an open air prison, so Israel completely controls the borders. So they control everything that comes in and everything that comes out. Something a known fact is that if you that Israel had literally counted. I don't know the study exactly where this is from, but I remember the study. Rania might be able to know and help put it if you know where it is, Rania. But there was a study made that that Israel would make like count the calories that Palestinians would need to technically live, so that they're not so legally they're not held accountable for starvation, but the reality is that they're starving the people, and they would make that count on purpose. So that's how much control Israel has in Gaza. So that's how much they don't allow coming in and out. And they often like would basic needs, whether it's with food, medical supplies, they would deny entry. They wouldn't allow them to go through the border and to come into Gaza. So yeah, so that is not true. What is said. Okay, so then the next section is in 1974, the PLO actually did gain legitimate representation by the UN, and they gained observer status as representative of the Palestinian people. So what changed with this? It was important in the fact that it's a symbolic significance. So it solidified the PLO's legitimacy on a world level. So like I mentioned before, after the 1982 Lebanon war, it basically gained attention on a world front for the Palestinian struggle and for what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. Palestinians became more unified under the PLO. And then the diplomatic impact was that they started to gain the ability to participate in UN discussions, but because they're under observer status, they don't have voting rights. But at the same, again, you had the status to speak for the Palestinian chance to speak for ourselves, and the Palestinian narrative reaching a broader audience, and also to challenge Israel's one-sided framing. So if you're only hearing the story from one side, you're never going to know the other. So you Palestinians basically had more of a voice. And because of this UN recognition, it also resulted in more support for Palestinian self-determination. So it was a resolution 3236 that reaffirmed Palestinians' right to self-determination, national independence and sovereignty, and the right of return to the homeland. At the same time, what didn't change, there wasn't, tangible on the ground change at this point. So there wasn't any effect of changing ending the occupation or reversing the settlement expansion or the conditions of the Palestinians on the ground. And it also dismissed like the PLO's higher political aspirations. So there wasn't an enforcement basically of this. So because they were on an observer status, it limited their influence. Like I said, they didn't have voting rights, but they had speaking rights and discussion rights. And then the funny thing is though, because many people will say, well, like, so then what's the point? But at the same time, even this, just having this status, Israel tried to take that away. So Israel countermeasures, they intensified their attacks on the PLO and the efforts to delegitimize them on a diplomatic front. And then they also relaunched military operations against the PLO's bases, specifically in Lebanon, where they still had their base. And the long-term impact of this is while the immediate effects were limited, the 1974 recognition actually lays the groundwork for future advocacy efforts. So we'll see it in a little bit. It eventually contributed to the Oslo Accords, where the PLO were formally engaged in peace negotiations. And also, like I've said before, broader global acknowledgement of the Palestinian struggle, especially in basically the non-Western nations, so more developing nations were more supportive of Palestine because of this. And then moving on from this, so Palestinians living under occupation. So these two pictures are actually pictures of the ID cards that we mentioned earlier. So Palestinians living under occupation as this, happened. I know I'm jumping a little bit, so bear with me. It's just a lot to do in one session. So collective punishment also was something else that Palestinians were dealing with at this time under the occupation. So the ID cards, like we said, were needed for movement. This class that I took with a professor from Palestine said you could leave Palestine without you could leave your home without your soul, but you could not leave your home without your ID card. And I know Palestinians have firsthand experience. I know, like, I'm thinking like Rania's family once had a situation because they forgot the ID. One of them forgot the ID card. So that, like, your identity is put in your ID card. And again, it's just another way that Israel suppresses Palestinians. And then something else, another form of collective punishment that I just personally find shocking and just just crazy is restrictions on burials. So they restrict when Palestinians can bury their dead, and also just on literally on the bodies of the dead. So recently, like with the release of Palestinian political prisoners, this discussion's coming up a lot. So many Palestinians that were detained or were arrested by Israel will get like multiple life sentences. So what they do is after the Palestinian is dead, they do not give them back the families the bodies. So Palestinian families are not allowed to even grieve and bury their loved ones. So again, it's just another example of how Israel's oppression and violence goes so far. Beyond this, there was also a disruption in, again, we already said political participation, but even in just education. And then later you had a shift with elections. So in 1976, Palestinians had the first local elections, which was boycotted by many in the beginning because it was seen as kind of like a normalization. And actually the PLO encouraged people to boycott it. And it was because a lot of the elections were just family based, and later on the PLO then became recognized internationally, and like I said, they had the observer seat in the UN, and then agreed to participate in the local elections. And this made the emergence of a new middle class of Palestinians that were the educated Palestinian middle class. Okay, it's 8:30. Oh, we're actually not bad on time. So, okay, I'm gonna play this video too. This just talks more about Palestinian life under occupation.
Occupation here is at the heart of the story. It's the elephant in the room. It's about the 3 million Palestinians living in the occupied West Bank under the occupation. And it's not only about them, it's about those not born yet. My name is Rania Zabane, and I'm a producer covering the West Bank from Ramallah. Between us, I fear it'll be more of the same. The vast majority of Palestinians were born and raised under occupation, so it became pretty much part and parcel of their lives to be waiting in long lines at checkpoints, to have Israeli soldiers knocking on their doors. The fact that nothing is predictable is pretty much the only predictable thing living under occupation. Now, Ramallah is a bit different. It's a bit of a bubble. It became a hub for the Palestinian Authority. It's vibrant. It has lots of international organizations. But go a bit outside and reality hits again. You've got refugee camps, you've got checkpoints, you've got walls. I've been covering the West Bank for 20 years. Being a Palestinian before being a journalist has its own set of restrictions. You have the physical challenges that have to do with barriers and movement restrictions. While I can't go to occupied Jerusalem without an Israeli permit, a foreign journalist can. And then there are the unseen barriers. I end up scrutinizing my own work to make sure that people don't think I'm biased. At the end of the day, I'm a journalist. I'm not an activist, nor a parrot. But there are pros for being a Palestinian journalist. You understand the complications, the nuances, and the context of the story. For example, you go to a funeral and you see a mother ululating. That doesn't mean she's happy. The woman just lost a child. But as a Palestinian, you know she's trying to show resilience. There's also a bonus for being a woman journalist because I can have access to places that other people might not necessarily have access to. For example, I can speak to Bedouin women. What I like to do is tell little stories and go into details, like spend some time with those people. Take annexation, for example. It's such an abstract term, but how is it going to affect Karima? How is it going to affect Muhammad living 2 tents down the hill? Permit is another example. The term is so bloodless, and yet people could lose their lives waiting for such a permit. In some stories, you really need an Israeli voice because you need to question the authorities. If Palestinians and international organizations say that home demolitions are collective punishment, you have to have an Israeli voice to respond to people's accusations or concerns or fears.
They didn't just destroy my house, they destroyed my dreams. They destroyed a family and a life.
And while you know that their answer is going to be by the book,
Israeli authorities say some homes built close to the separation fence are a security risk and have to be destroyed.
you have to include it because that's their answer. But sometimes I feel like we really don't have to. We report on a population under occupation, so equating the occupier and the occupied would be inherently biased. There are lots of unsung heroes in this place. The people who live in the Jordan Valley with so little and yet decide they want to stay there. The people who have lost children or have loved ones tortured and choose to remain hopeful. What else motivates me? My kids, I want them to have a life better than mine. To be honest, I try to keep my kids as far away from the conflict as possible and not fill them in on the details of my job. But you can't raise kids in a bubble. They ask, why am I grumpy after covering the arson attack that killed the Dawabsha family in Douma? Or why do I smell like skunk water when covering a protest? And you have to come up with answers that are true, but at the same time, that doesn't teach them to hate. And it's tricky. I think that injustice anywhere should be looked at seriously. Palestinians have been marginalized by the US administration, by the Arab world, and even by their own authority. Most Palestinians would tell you that annexation isn't new. It's been happening for years. The discourse shifted from why the occupation should end to why annexation is bad for Israel. And Palestinians are being sidelined in a story that pertains directly to them. They're sick and tired of waiting. Most people we meet would tell you that they fear that they're losing their most important asset, hope. And that's scary.
So I just thought the reason I played this video was we can talk about so much that happens to Palestinians in the West Bank, but there's so much that you're not always going to hear and you're not always going to see or get the full story. So what's interesting about this journalist is she talks about, like, the stories of the people, and the reality is there's so much that's always happening, and at the end of the day, this is the daily life of Palestinians under occupation. It's not just an abstract concept or thing that we can talk about theoretically, but it's the lived experience in every single day of every single life. And I think that's the most important part of what she said, that I really wanted to address.
Occupation here is at
Okay. Oh. Right. So the next section of this is just, why does the world support Israel? There's, a few different reasons. It is a colonial project. So Israel's essentially, like, was placed within if you see where it is, within the Arab world, because it's a tool that will support Western interests, now, the US interests, and help support and maintain colonial dominance there. In terms of the US, so a lot of people that woke up this past year asked this question, like, realizing, why is our country supporting this foreign country, and the amount of aid that we give to the US. If you look, I don't have the website if anyone has it, but there's USCPR has a great tool. You can literally search up how much military aid our country alone, New Jersey, sends so much, in billions of our tax dollars goes every year to Israel. So why is this? It's strategic alliances. It's because they have stakes to support Israel. The U.S. is part of it, and if we see it with the genocide, a lot of people are saying, the U.S. isn't stopping it, and many people would argue, well, it's not our business, but it is, because the U.S. is one of the biggest enablers of it. So if you look at the genocide alone, I think 50,000 tons of US-made bombs were sent directly to Israel to facilitate the genocide. And then in terms of the Arab world, which we'll talk about in a little, is even in terms of many of the Arab countries, Palestine, would dismantle again the colonial structures. So there's a term that many people say, many people you'll hear, is that Palestine is at the intersection of all oppression, and Palestine is at the intersection of all freedom. So this goes back to Our Freedom is the Future class, that we really believe that the liberation of Palestine is not just the liberation of Palestine itself, but a liberation for all, because it's rooted in justice. So all of these different systems of oppression are aligned with Palestine. I just, for time's sake, I'm gonna skip this video, but I do highly encourage you to watch it. This is Noam Chomsky, and he talks about why the US supports Israel so much.
Why does the
All right, so the next major shift in 1978 was in September 17th, 1978 Camp David Accords. At this time, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and the Israeli Prime Minister of the time, Menachem, began with US President Jimmy Carter to sign the Camp David Accords in Washington. So the idea of this was that it's going to be a peace treaty to be signed between Israel and Egypt, and they established diplomatic relations between the two. And if you remember, we talked about post-1967, after Egypt lost to Israel, they lost the Sinai. And then the Suez. So part of this was that Israel would withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula in stages, and then they also agreed to meet to try to resolve the Palestinian question. So they included Jordan in this, as well as a representative from the Palestinian people. So the idea was that they would have a 5-year transitional period where Israel would also withdraw from the West Bank and Gaza, and then introduce Palestinian self-government. It also called for an end to the Israeli settlements in the West Bank, and did not but it didn't address the question of East Jerusalem. So all of this happened, and as we can see today, it did not help the Palestinian people. So this was just a step in diplomatic relations that just fell through and didn't actually give the Palestinian people anything after these meetings. Then a major shift for Palestinians after this was the First Intifada. Intifada translates to shake off. So the Intifada there was the first Intifada and then the second, and then later we'll talk a little bit about the Unity Intifada. But this was from 1987 to 1993. It was a major part of Palestinian history, and it refers to the 1987 uprising against Israel. So the reason this started was when an Israeli truck hit Palestinians and it killed 4 Palestinians. And the anger and rage that arose from these deaths sparked many uprisings and confrontations between Palestinians, specifically many from the refugee camps. And it actually started from refugee camps in Gaza, and then it grew, and it became this widespread protest from the Palestinian people, and just showed the frustrations that were being built up until this point. So this is the late 80s of the Palestinians that were living under occupation. So these uprisings were very unique and significant, not only because it was sporadic, but also because through them, it brought about a whole new way of protest for the Palestinians, specifically the youth. And this was all under the new political the political leadership of the PLO. This is actually when we started seeing like the rock throwing tactics. So I'm gonna play the video, and then we'll continue to talk about this a little bit. So this just gives you more context, and I just want you to see the images, but around 10,000 people attended the funerals. What I think is really important for what sparked the first Intifada is 4 Palestinians were killed. Look at how many Palestinians were killed this past year. So the official numbers state over 47,000, but if you go by the Lancet report and others, the projected number is over 186,000. Because of different reasons with the reporting. But what I mean to say is that over time, Israel has purposefully and deliberately desensitized not only the world, but Palestinians to Palestinian death. So this was at the first Intifada was 20 years of occupation. And as much as we talked about, all of those restrictions that they were being put on them, it wasn't to the point that they were killing them. But at this point, okay, we saw this like, and I don't want to say they weren't being killed. They were obviously being killed, and we had all these massacres. But what I mean to say is that there was a spark of, we can't keep living under this. This is something we're going to fight back against. And this is what happened in the first Intifada. This was like a big buildup, and then we saw this big spread of Palestinian unity and grassroots a grassroots movement and a grassroots uprising during the first Intifada. So I did talk a little bit about So I did talk about the initial spark. So there was widespread anger, and then we saw this unified resistance for one of the first times in a long time. So there was mobilization across Palestine, so across the West Bank, Gaza, and even within Israel. So we saw demonstrations, strikes, and boycott all being used as tools of resistance. So something I think is really interesting, whenever people talk about BDS and the boycott movement, they point to South Africa as being, the leader in boycott. And yes, yes, we do we do look at South Africa as a great model because they were successful in it, but not many people talk about, the first Intifada. Palestinians themselves engaged in strong and effective boycott. So here we talk a little bit about the committees. So they formed committees. There was mutual aid committee, so for food relief. People would donate and like gather supplies to then be able to split amongst themselves, because like I mentioned before, Israel completely controlled the economy. So they decided, we're going to boycott Israel economy, and we're going to help each other with supplies. And they would actually, they would have convoys with supplies that they would smuggle through the mountains after curfew. There's a movie, and I think I'll put it in the chat to and on Google Classroom, called The Wanted 18, where Palestinians smuggled cows for the milk, and it's made as like a satire where the cows talk. But it's just amazing, because the fact that this is how far they went in their boycott, how far Palestinians, how innovative and creative they were. So they literally got these cows, and it was a whole thing about like the cow's perspective. I highly recommend you watch it. But just again to show you what they did during this time. And then there was a really strong united front, so Palestinians from Israel, because if you know, like, the Palestinians within Israel usually get a little bit, better living conditions than the West Bank. So they were providing food to the Palestinians in the West Bank and helping them. And then there were daily supply routes where they would try to work together to support each other. There was also medical relief committees, so the occupation controlled hospitals, and they would monitor and register patients. So Palestinians, for fear, like, you can be taken from a hospital and get imprisoned from there or tortured. So they said, we're going to boycott the hospitals and we're going to support each other. They had medical aid groups. They made first aid kits. They started to have training for their own nurses. Women, it was amazing. I read once that women would hide like pamphlets that they were trying to spread the messages of the revolution. So they had to hide it because they'd get confiscated. They'd bake bread and hide the papers in the bread. So all of these different ways that Palestinians were forming committees. They were neighborhood committees, guardian committees, all to fight back against the occupation in amazing ways. There was also the education, so there was alternative education. So the Israeli authorities shut down the schools, which they do often. And at this time, they shut them down indefinitely, schools and universities. So Palestinians started teaching each other. So they formed like cohorts and volunteered, and so that the students wouldn't lose a year of school. And you see that today with this past year with the genocide. Palestinians were teaching each other from the tents. They were doing online schooling, all these different ways to continue. And then, like I said before, there was the boycott of Israeli products, and it actually did heavily affect the Israeli economy at this time. So measures in response by Israel, Israel, reacted heavily, and obviously after all this, as amazing as it was, the Intifada ended up, it wasn't able to last. But some of the repression and Israeli policies was random killings. So Israeli policy was they started to use live bullets and just arbitrary killings to discourage any kind of resistance. They had something called a bone-breaking policy, where if you were a stone thrower, so you always see that iconic image of children throwing stones at tanks. It obviously is not going to do anything, but they would do bone-breaking policies that if you were caught throwing stones, they would physically like break your limbs. And the reason for this wasn't only to discourage Palestinians, but also because the prisons were so overflowed, they didn't have enough space to imprison them. And at this time, they also because of the prison overflow was because of mass arrests. So over 50,000 Palestinians were imprisoned at the time, and 415 were exiled to Lebanon. And this was the time of Ismail Haniyeh's exile. And then also the increase in home demolitions, which we saw earlier in the video. And just one example is in Beta, and in many home demolitions were starting at this time. And this just showed you, just a diagram that I think you should definitely check out later. Just showing you throughout, not only when it started in the first Intifada, but the continuation of deaths and the violence inflicted upon Palestinians at this time. So the legacy of the first Intifada, what it resulted in, so it really showed the power of the unified resistance, and the unity that could happen between the Palestinians. It also set the groundwork for international recognition for the Palestinian demand. Because of all of this, people were asking, well, what did the Palestinians want? Like, they were forced to notice, the occupation is not just something that we're happily living in. It's suppression and it's violence, and it needs to stop. And it also resulted in much of the Arab leaders seeing this uprising, and it spread kind of a fear among their own country. So again, this just reinforces, why do the Arab countries around Palestine not support, and it's just for self-interest essentially. Then we saw so again, Palestinians were being seen more at this time, following this, even though the first Intifada obviously did end. So in 1988, they held a press conference in East Jerusalem, and Palestinians collectively called for an end to the occupation. It was at this time that the PLO actually proclaimed Palestinian statehood. So they did have a declaration of independence, and it was in 11/15/1988. Ronnie, I'm thinking of your dad right now for this. And then it sparked international discussions on the Palestinian cause. So basically, everyone was finally asking Palestinians, so what do you want? They forced the world to listen and to hear it. And the demands that they were asking for really was just, we want an end to occupation. We want to live, like we mentioned before. What do Palestinians want? Self-determination, the right of return. What should be basic things. And all of this was because they wanted to stop the rise in the Intifada. And okay. All right, I'm gonna skip over. So next we had the Oslo Accords. So the Oslo Accords were essentially a result of the first Intifada, and it was pressure from Palestine, and then the Arab countries, like I mentioned, this fear of their own people rising. So they started to want to support basically Palestinian freedom because of this. So then we had the Oslo Agreements, or the Oslo Accords. So 1993, we saw the Oslo Accords. They were a series of agreements between Israel and Palestinians, and it was signed in the 1990s. It was meant to be a 5-year plan. So following the first Intifada, there was so much Palestinian loss of life. There was so much bloodshed to the Palestinians that the Oslo Accords came, and it was an effort, okay, look, the people were dying. People were it was a very it was a lot of loss and a lot of bloodshed. So the Oslo Accords was meant to be a peace process, and it's supposed to be a solution that it's going to end that. And it planned for so there were the 5 phases that they were supposed to be enacted in that. So it was established, it was first known as the Declaration of Principles, and it established a timetable for this peace process for Palestine. So it would have first a Palestinian government in Gaza, as well as in Jericho, Ariha, and the West Bank. Israeli Prime Minister Itzhak Rabin and Palestinian PLO leader Yasser Arafat shook hands and agreed to this. The U.S. wasn't actively involved, but facilitated the negotiations. And the meetings were actually carried out in secret over several months in 1992, 1993. And it was Oslo I and Oslo II, and included provisions for the complete withdrawal of Israeli troops from 6 West Bank cities and 450 towns. And then also was supposed to establish a Palestinian Legislative Council. So during this, there are a few different parts to it. So a lot of people will criticize it, and in the next one we'll watch like why Oslo is seen as a failure. But the reality of it is, and this is really important when we talk about what people say about Palestinians. The Oslo Accords is a perfect example for when people say, you know, that common myth, Palestinians don't want peace, they just want to keep attacking, and that's completely wrong. It's the opposite, as you are hopefully all learning in this class. But in Oslo, Palestinians gave up so much because they saw, again, the loss of life, and they saw the violence that was being enacted on Palestinians, and because they wanted to have some kind of a solution, and they wanted peace. They wanted our people to stop being killed and to stop dying. So the Palestinians gave up a big chunk. So the Oslo agreements, if you look at the ceasefire agreements this year, how it kept going back and forth and back and forth, and Israel kept saying, no, we don't want it. And then we want the Palestinians to give up less. The reason, this is the same playbook that they used with Oslo. We're going to keep going back and forth because they just want Palestinians to get the least and they get the most. So to go over just a few parts of it, the PLO recognized Israel as a state during this peace process in return for Israel to recognize the PLO as the governing body for the Palestinian people. They had the Jericho Agreement. The PLO was asked to renounce terrorism as well as other violence, and its desire for the destruction of the Israeli state, and that within 5 years, they would have a permanent settlement based on the UN Security Council 242 and 338. And Palestinians would have self-rule in the West Bank and Gaza within those 5 years. And they would be split into 3 zones, so A, B, and C. And then would have, and they were actually, so, and then and, you know, at the end of this, the Palestinians did not get what they were supposed to get, even though after Israel took what they wanted, they didn't follow through. And even during this Oslo agreement, which again, I'm like deja vu, same thing's happening now. People criticized the prime minister for even agreeing to that. As little as Palestinians got and as much as they were, you know, cheated out of the agreement, he was criticized even for doing that. And he was told that he's giving away land that's Israel to the Palestinians. And they actually agreed at the time, well, we can always go back. This was like behind, you know, closed door meetings that they can go back to it. And they, so basically the whole point of this is that Palestinians did try. So, and when people say like, why don't you try? They did try, and Israel didn't abide by it. This just goes into a little more of the key provisions of it and the details. So, the renouncement of violence. So, this is a very loaded term. So when people say like the PLO, you have to renounce terrorism. I think this goes back to a larger discussion of why are Palestinians called, why is it called terrorism, and why is any kind of resistance to an oppression called terrorism, because it's on the, so basically, why are you calling the people that are being oppressed the terrorists? And this term continues until today when we talk about the Arabs and Muslims. And this is all, you know, all goes back to a lot of very problematic renouncement, and what, like, it's basically, we're going to call you this as a way to villainize and vilify you, and vilify the Palestinian people. So this again is just, this is what I said before. I didn't realize I put this slide there. And then why is it significant? Again, they were defending themselves, but it was being called terrorism, and they were being forced to abandon any kind of resistance and any kind of violence. Whereas Israel continued its violence, Israel continues to this day its violence, and this was when, you know, you really set the trope of the Arab terrorist term that we see until today. Because of time's sake, I'm not gonna play this video, but it just goes into more of like how did Oslo really benefit Israel, and for, you know, Palestinians, how much it was lost, and this is just if you wanna learn more about that, I do recommend you watch it. Then the second major shift was the Second Intifada.
There's
Oh,
just a question in the chat about the percentages in the pie chart from the slide before.
thank you. Okay. What are the percentages? Oh, thank you. Let me answer. So area 18% is meant to be administered by the PA. So yeah, so I can go back to it, but we are gonna share this this presentation with everyone after. But do you have any questions, any other questions about it? I'm trying to. I'm just reading through the comments, so I'll take a pause. I know I'm going through, I'm trying to get through everything.
Don't worry, I'm watching the comments. You can keep going.
Thank you. Right, so the second intifada, then I can go back to it after, but again, we are going to share all the slides. So then the major shift was in the second intifada. So like I said before, the Oslo Accords were supposed to go into effect and were supposed to be followed through and Palestinians were supposed to be given what they were promised within a 5-year phase, but that wasn't happening. That wasn't being followed. And then on top of that, what helped spark the second Intifada was Ariel Sharon, who, if you remember, he basically allowed for the Sabra and Shatila massacre. He was tried for it. He was removed, but then was put on cabinet, and then he ended up becoming he was a prime minister still. So he visited Masjid al-Aqsa, and this was seen as a slap in the face for Palestinians. Like, why would he go there? And this was supposed to be a protected space for Palestinians, and it triggered anger by many Palestinians. Because by 1998, according to Oslo, things should have been better for the Palestinian people, and yet they had reached from 98 and then 2000, nothing that had been promised was done, so the people revolted again, and this was the second intifada, so the second major uprising. So the nature of resistance of this time was, you saw, was more violent. So there was mass protests, there was the stone throwing, there were clashes with Israeli soldiers, and then also armed resistance against the Israeli military. And I will play one of these, not both, because I think the image of Muhammad Dora is really important. This was an iconic image, so I'll just
بما انه احنا في ارضنا ويعني يعني مش راح نهاجر راح نضلنا في ارضنا.
I do want to just pause on this. So this image, I just feel like it's really important. This became like an iconic image from the Second Intifada. So this was Mohammed Adura, and later on, even this past year, again, Jamal Adura's the father, and this was basically caught on live television. So if you were anyone that was following the Palestinian struggle, or if you were Palestinian, you'll remember this image and you'll never forget it. It was caught on live television, and they were trying to hide from the soldiers, and they were killed point blank. So I can never forget the images of this time, because you saw it live happening, and yeah. So this was again just another precedent of the Israeli violence that is enacted on Palestinians. So they were trying to hide from it here, and this was in Gaza. And then this past year, there's some people may have seen it if you're following him, but Jamal Adura, the father, then this year lost his other son, so he was also killed. So I think it's just really important to keep making these connections, because what happens in Palestine, none of it is in a vacuum. It all is just, if you zoom out, it's all just part of Israel's continued violence against Palestinians. So I'm not going to play the rest of it, but just again, please do continue to watch this and to watch these and follow whatever you can. So Israel's response was from the Second Intifada was brutal military crackdowns. At this time, this is when they also were attacking Palestinians from the air, so through airstrikes. There was mass arrests. There were arbitrary killings. The curfew was reenacted. And then there were also targeted assassinations of this time. So this is when, for example, like Ahmed Yassin was killed at this time. And then the context of this, again, was that Palestinians lost faith in the peace process. So that's why they turned to armed struggle at the time. And at this time, this is when Israeli settlements in the West Bank and Gaza had tripled. And these were supposed to be the peace years. Palestinians saw the continuation of the occupation, the deterioration in their economy, and the lack of any kind of progress in terms of Palestinian statehood and even, you know, the refugee situation, the checkpoints and closures, and so on. So all of this was a build-up that resulted in the Second Intifada.
بما إنه إحنا في أرض
Major events during the Second Intifada. So we had a few. In 2002, you saw the Battle of Jenin. This is in Jenin refugee camp in the West Bank, and it was a devastating Israeli military assault on the Jenin camp. Israel invaded and killed. I don't have the numbers of Jenin specifically, but in general, over 4,000 Palestinians were killed. Many were children. Tens of thousands were injured. And this was resulted in widespread destruction and war crimes committed by Israel. In 2002, you also saw Operation Defensive Shield. This targeted multiple West Bank cities, and it included assault, sieges of the cities, and home demolitions. And then a very major result of this was the separation wall. I didn't have a bigger picture of it here, but this is when Israel built the separation wall. And this is going back to transportation. This is when the separation wall, under the guise of security, further fragmented the West Bank. So it confiscated large areas of Palestinian land, and it literally went through Palestinian towns, families, homes. If you see like Beit Lahem, they talk a lot about like if you read more about Beit Lahem, until this day, the separation wall destroyed it because they literally separated the people. Families cannot see each other because of the separation wall, and this happens even till today. It affected transportation. There was a documentary we watched that I'll link if there's a public video of it called Infiltrators, and talks about how the lengths that Palestinians have had to go through to get through security, so it stopped many Palestinians from their daily life and their work. And this started with the separation wall. And then the legacy of the Second Intifada. So for Palestinians, it reinforced the understanding that true liberation can't just rely on the international negotiations, and it actually called for the more unity amongst Palestinian factions, and it rejuvenated this call that we have to work together and we have to unite for freedom against Israel. For Israel, it actually was used as a justification for expansion of settlements. It's why they justified the security, the building of this apartheid wall. That they called it a security wall against the Palestinians that were attacking them. So they used it to greater militarize and expand settlements. And then this shifted international perspective, where it heightened, again, it brought back global awareness, but it limited tangible support. And at this time, so the end of this, it shifted leadership. So at this time, this is when Yasser Arafat was then marginalized, and he was actually besieged by Israel in his Ramallah compound until his death in 2004. It wasn't ever, I don't think it was ever confirmed, but there's a lot that says that he was poisoned. I see you were about to say something, Anya.
I was gonna say it's always debated, but it was confirmed. Years later, they finally did something, and there was a study that showed that he was poisoned. I'll see if I can find it. But this is always like, is it a conspiracy theory? Is it real?
But I did see like there were certain quotes that like the leader said, like, if we got rid of him. So it was in their interest also to get rid of Yasser Arafat too. But yeah, it was said that he was poisoned. And then Mahmoud Abbas became president in 2005, and he took a less confrontational approach than Yasser Arafat after. So the impact on Palestinians, the PA, because after this became increasingly dependent on not only on Israel but also on international aid, and then it actually did the opposite. So it deepened international divisions because of this, especially between Fatah and Hamas. And then Israel's gains from this was, again, like I said, it used it as justification for greater militarization. It strengthened its control and hold on the West Bank, and it further delegitimized Palestinian resistance by labeling it as terrorism. And something that is really important, this past week, 200 Palestinians were released as part of the negotiation agreements of the ceasefire deal. And of those 200, a large majority were actually arrested during the Second Intifada. And they were in their teens, many of them, or their 20s. So these were all young kids that were being arrested, and imagine like they were getting, many of them were life sentences. And now with this week's release of many of the Palestinian political prisoners, I think it was 70, they were released, but they were sent to exile. So like again, I know I feel like I didn't mean to, but I feel like I keep saying it today. It's all connected and it all keeps happening. So many of these people were denied, freedom and daily life. They've been denied seeing their families, their loved ones for so long, and this was many was a result of this. Okay, so next slide. So next you had the deal of the century. This was a US proposed plan, officially titled the Peace to Prosperity Plan, and it was unveiled by President Donald Trump in 2020. So it began in 2017 and it didn't go into effect until 2020. And it was marketed as a proposal to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but it heavily favored Israeli interests and dismissed key Palestinian rights. So it claimed to have, economic development. It proposed a two-state solution, and it proposed regional stability and normalized relations between Israel and the Arab states. A real objective, that came out of this was it solidified Israeli control over Palestinian land. It eliminated many of the core Palestinian demands, such as the right of return, and claimed Jerusalem as the Israeli capital. So that was what Trump did in 2017. Oops, sorry. All right. And then this was a major turning point. So part of the deal was to declare Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. I think this is short, so I'm just gonna play this.
New fallout from President Trump's move to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital and ultimately move the U.S. embassy there. The president called the dramatic break from the past a step toward peace, but it is drawing a fierce reaction in the region and condemnation from a chorus of world leaders. Our chief global affairs anchor Martha Reddit's in Washington with all the latest. Good morning, Martha.
Good morning, George. Outside of Israeli support, there has been condemnation of President Trump's move across the globe, from the Arab world to European leaders who've called it regrettable, unhelpful. And Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas said the announcement could lead to wars that never end and shows that the U.S. can no longer be an honest broker in the peace process. And on the West Bank, you see there have been protests this morning with Israeli police firing tear gas into a crowd. But so far, the protests have been relatively small. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson in Vienna this morning is calling the president's move just a recognition of reality, since Israel has most of its government offices in Jerusalem, George.
Yeah, and one of the questions, will the protests escalate tomorrow? And at the heart of this are competing claims over the status of Jerusalem and what this means for the peace process.
Exactly. It's been assumed that if a two-state solution was ever agreed upon, East Jerusalem, which is majority Arab, would be the Palestinian capital, and West would be for the Israelis. But President Trump's announcement changes that, putting the U.S. clearly on the side of the Israelis, claiming it all. George.
Martha Raddatz, thanks for
So this drew condemnation from many countries. So this was in the UN, there was an overwhelming condemnation of it, so they did condemn this and rejected it for US to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel because it went against all, all promises and agreements up until this point. And Palestinians rejected it and said it was just it's a declaration of annexation and apartheid. And again, to connect it to today, already, so once, right immediately after the ceasefire agreement was just put in place in Gaza, in the last, when was it, like last week? It's crazy. President Trump then actually, so there were sanctions on Israeli settlers that were put in by the previous administration, and he actually, with the release of Palestinian prisoners, released a number of Israeli settlers who then went on to commit violent, like they were committing arson, fires, and attacking Palestinians in the West Bank, and that was to connect it back to last week. So this also resulted in normalization deals today, that we're seeing even until today. So from 2020 to 2021, this was an effect of the deal of the century. More Arab countries then began to normalize relations publicly with Israel, whereas prior to this, it wasn't something that they would do, even if there were, there was some support or agreements beforehand, but in the back end, they became more comfortable to just do this publicly. And this again just added more to Israel's power within the region. So there were mixed reactions to this. I'm not going to play the video because of time's sake, but Jordan rejected the plan, and they said that this was a danger to Palestinian sovereignty and Jerusalem's status, whereas Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain expressed support for the economic aspects, but then they didn't fully endorse it. And then later, we're going to talk about the Abraham Accords, then, suggested approval of this. And they reaffirmed commitment to the two-state solution based on the pre-1967 borders. The UN and the UE did, and at the same time criticizing the plan for undermining international law. At the end of it, this continued. So in 2019, it continued settlement expansion. So Israel, it continued and intensified their illegal settlements, particularly in the West Bank. And then it also started the Abraham Accords for Arabs that was agreed upon between the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco, where they formally normalized ties with Israel, bypassing Palestinian demands, and Palestinians obviously saw this as a complete betrayal from the solidarity. So again, I'm not going to play the video, but please do, I do encourage you to watch it. Okay, next, coming closer. So meanwhile in Gaza, a major shift was in 2018, and it was from 2018 to 2019. You saw the Great March of Return. So during this, it was a series of mass protests in Gaza. It started March 30th, 2018, and they actually started on Land Day, the commemoration of Land Day, and continued weekly until December 2019. So this was basically thousands of Palestinians in Gaza that literally just physically marched to the borders as a form of protest, demanding the right of return for Palestinian refugees and their descendants during the Nakba, and an end to the Israeli imposed blockade of Gaza. So something that's really important to note is that, so right now we have the Nakba of 2023. We talked about the Nakba of 48 last week, but what's happening in Gaza, many have said it's not only is the Nakba systematic because it keeps happening, but it also, the 2023 of last year and 2024 of this year, what's happening in Gaza is also called another Nakba. But many of the Palestinians in Gaza that are being displaced now and that have been displaced were actually refugees from the original Nakba in 1948. So 70% of the Palestinians that live in Gaza were actually refugees from the 48. So this movement demanded the right of return for wait, did I say it right? The percentage? Oh, okay, I thought.
No, sorry, it was the comment, not.
Oh, okay. It's like my numbers. I try to remember all my numbers, right? So the background and context of this, so again, to go back to what causes these things, none of them happen in a vacuum. At the time, it was a crisis in Gaza. So we talked already about the land, sea, and air blockade since 2007. It created horrible living conditions for Palestinians. There were over 2 million Palestinians in Gaza that were facing a high unemployment rate. They had limited to no access to healthcare, electricity, basic resources, clean water, and a blockade that blocked off even like their, to travel outside of Gaza, you have to get a permit and be allowed to do it, and Israel often denies it, and so on and so forth. And the historical significance of the time was they drew from the 48 Nakba, and also Land Day, to recall the Palestinians that were killed in the land confiscation in 1976. So this was a very powerful nonviolent grass movement, organized by civil society groups within Gaza. Children were involved, families, youth activists from outside were attracted to it, and they all gathered at the Gaza, the separation fence. And they staged demonstrations, they built tents, and so on. And the Israeli response was to attack them with live ammunition and rubber bullets and tear gas, to suppress all these protests. And the argument was that they were defending their borders. And I can't remember what it is. I'll try to find it later. But a huge amount of Palestinians were they became amputees. So a large population of Palestinians they had to have amputations, and a lot of it was the violence inflicted upon them during these protests. Yes, Rania.
My laptop's been slow. Sorry, Besma. I just wanted to address the comments in the chat because I think this is very important. So Palestinians historically have always been Muslim, Christians, and Jews. Historically, that's always been the case in the reality. What has happened with the Zionist movement is that it became like kind of like a white supremacy with the Judaism and specifically Jewish people. So it became like that was separate. The ones that decided to be more in line with the Zionist movement. So the reality of the occupation and everything we're saying, it's not about Palestinian Muslims. It's about Palestinians, period. And it does not differentiate between Palestinian Muslims and Christians. Muslims and Christians in Palestine actually live very much side by side. I would say Muslims and Christians in Palestine live better than they even live in America, where they don't differentiate based on religion. They don't see they see each other as just brother and sisters living under the same struggle. And there's a long history of it. You can see it in Jerusalem, you can see it in Bethlehem. We actually at PAC invited the main priest in Bethlehem, Munzir Isaac, and he came and he spoke about the occupation as a force. The difference is that what had happened early on, around the first and second Intifada, because of the fact that, again, the white supremacy that comes into this and, Muslims being terrorists, there was a huge movement of churches in America that opened up their arms to Palestinian Christians. So a lot of Palestinian Christians actually migrated out of Palestine during this time. So that's why a lot of time you see a lot of Muslims. It's not because Muslims are right now they are the physical majority left in Palestine, but historically it was never like, majority. They were all, pretty much the same. The difference was that a lot of Christians left Palestine. So like, for example, a lot of the Palestinian American communities in Palestine, the historic ones, like the ones that have been here for longer, are actually Christian communities, because the Muslim communities migrated here more after the Second Intifada. While around the 1948, so once the Nakba happened, a lot of Christian American churches opened up their doors here, or European churches, and were inviting Christians to come through there. So that's a lot of the, and unfortunately, the Christian Zionist movement in America has destroyed the perception of Christianity in Palestine. And it makes it seem like it's a us versus them. When I'm telling you, like growing up here, I went to many villages in Palestine and it was shocked because there is no us versus them. It's very brotherly. They don't see it. They just see us as Palestinians. And there's plenty of fun facts. So for example, the Nativity Church, the Holy Sepulchre Church in Jerusalem, Muslims actually hold the keys to it. Not because of suppression or anything like that, just because, again, this idea of brotherly, I think the neighbor to the church is as a Muslim, and historically from the times of post the Crusades, they used to hold the keys and open the doors. So there's a lot of very like positive brotherly and sisterly love between Muslims and Christians, and they don't see it separately. They see them as just living under the oppression and occupation of Israel. Sorry, Besma, I didn't mean to go on a tangent, but I felt like I could not explain this.
Thank you. Also, if you guys read the Trinity of Fundamentals, The narrator is a Palestinian Christian, and it's barely mentioned, but you could see the integration of the religions. Manar?
Oh, I was also going to say the idea of like Eurocentric Christianity since the Crusades. When the Crusaders first came into like Palestine, they actually also massacred a lot of Christian Arab because they didn't see them as like Euro like centric Arab. So that was also one of the reasons why there was like solidarity between the Muslims and the Christians, because when the Muslims took over again, one of the biggest promises was that the churches, the Arab like Christians and their churches and the Orthodox would be protected. And so it's not just like, I guess, American Christian Zionists. It's like a very Eurocentric like movement that tried to divide the Muslims and the Christians, and they did end up protecting each other, which like what Rania said, like even though like the Muslim family like that opens up the church that goes way back to all the way from like the history of the Crusaders.
Thank you, Manar. Okay, so we're almost. All right, so to go back to the Great March of Return, so the key demands was the right of return, based on UN Resolution 194 that just affirmed the refugees' right of return to their homes, and it also called at this time an end to the siege. So it was a 12+ year blockade that had been affecting Gaza's economy and infrastructure. So they were calling for an end to that. The results of this was over 300 Palestinians killed, including journalists, medics, and children. More than 35,000 were injured. So this is when I mentioned, like, when we say injured, we don't just mean like, something light. There were Palestinians that were amputated. Many had permanent disabilities as a result of this, and this was all because of Israel's intense attacks on them. And one, I'm gonna put it. I'm gonna skip. So I'm gonna skip the video again just because of time, but I do think you should watch them. So here, oh, sorry guys. I'm like thinking okay. Okay, going back. I went there. So here's just a few photos from the Great March. So if you look down here, this is actually Razana Najjar. She was a Palestinian nurse. And it was a very, she was killed by Israel at this time, while trying to nurse someone. And her picture was really, it became very symbolic and spread. So this was literally just a nurse on duty trying to help someone, and they attacked her. And the Great March of Return in general, again, is one of those examples of, literally they were just marching, they were just walking, and this only happened in 2018. And you see the violence that Israel enacts upon the Palestinians in return. Okay, and then moving forward, to jump ahead a little bit, is the Sheikh Jarrah occupation. So, So the Sheikh Jarrah uprisings it sparked because Israel was attempting to forcibly displace many Palestinian families in Sheikh Jarrah. I should have put the one of the "You're stealing my house," but there was a video that came out of Mona al-Kurd. So until now, Mohammed al-Kurd, her brother, lives in New York and talks very often about the Palestinian struggle in general, not just about this, but it became very they became kind of popularized from this. Where they were forced to share their home with settlers because Israeli settlers literally just encroached upon their home because they have the full right to do that. And there's a video where she was like just telling him like, why are you trying to steal my house? And he's like, well, if I don't steal it, someone else will. And this guy is called Jacob or Yakub, whatever, and he was literally from New York. So he was a settler that decided, because he has the birthright, because anyone that can claim that they're Israeli or that they have Jewish descent can just go to Israel and decide, I want to live in a Palestinian home, and they are given full citizenship rights, and they can take a Palestinian's home and they can do whatever they want. So the Sheikh Jarrah was a town in Jerusalem that was getting attacked for this. And they were trying to forcibly displace many Palestinian families, and this sparked international solidarity, it sparked protests within Palestine and then international solidarity, and it also was after an escalation of attacks by settlers, I don't know if we mentioned this before, but when we talk about Israeli settlers, these are people that, again, they can come from anywhere, come and live there, but it's not like they're just residents and they're just peaceful residents that just want to live. This Israeli settlers enact daily violence upon Palestinians in different ways. So again, they are fully backed by the Israeli military to steal Palestinian homes. They often attack Palestinians. If you go to any part of Israel and you see settlers, they will easily carry like the biggest weapons, and they can go around daily life like this. And they do it to terrorize Palestinians. They regularly burn down Palestinian homeland. They destroy buildings and homes. They destroy down to the olive trees, so much, and this happens all the time. And actually, if you want to, get regular updates, not only should you follow all these different accounts on social media, but also we send out regular statements about these updates. So just subscribe and you will get those as well.
This is Sheikh Jarrah. Since Israel occupied East Jerusalem in 1967, Israeli settler organizations have been trying to remove Palestinians from their homes, not just in this neighborhood, but others too. The issue's been subject to decades-long court cases. At the core are two main issues. Settlers claim Jews own the properties, citing Ottoman-era records. And Palestinians argue they were allowed to remain in Sheikh Jarrah through an agreement between Jordan and the United Nations. Lawyers for the Jewish settlers claim that because the land was occupied by Israel in 1967, previous agreements are null and void. Lawyers for the Palestinians counter-argue that previous agreements must stand and that the residents have protected status.
So just because of time's sake, I pause it there, but the issue and the dispute in Sheikh Jarrah also goes back to the 1967 borders of the Nexus. So again, it's all connected. So then I'm just trying to like rush through these now. So definitely watch these videos. And then this resulted also in then another attack on Gaza. So in Yes. So at the same time, this is when we call the Sheikh Jarrah uprisings triggered. So Israeli police and military started to attack Al-Aqsa Mosque. This was during Ramadan while Muslims were all fasting. And this is like the most popular time for Palestinians to go to Al-Aqsa Mosque. You have the night prayers, and Israeli soldiers and military would go in. They would throw tear gas upon the Palestinians. There was one night I remember they literally just tied a bunch of Palestinians up. They are physically violent, and so on. And then this resulted in an 11-day attack that killed over 260 Palestinians. And then just to try to summarize it, it started in Sheikh Jarrah, and then it started attacking Gaza. So then this was another round of attacks on Gaza, and then a ceasefire was brokered, but as we mentioned before, Gaza was already devastated, so it just further exasperated the situation there. Then 2022, we had Palestinian resistance and continued struggles. So this is when we saw a growth in or a regrowth in resistance movements in Jenin and Nablus, and what we called the Unity Intifada, which was a collective Palestinian resistance across Palestine. It resulted in Israeli raids, arrests, intensified operations against Palestinians in Jenin, Nablus, and Hebron or Khalil, and targeted assassinations of Palestinian leaders. And then this also had a global rise in solidarity from the outside world. So it renewed support for Palestine, and it also reinvigorated the BDS movement. And social media, I think, was a huge part of this. So this is when we first, like we keep talking about this year, a lot of it is because of social media. The Unity Intifada of this time was social media. So if you want to talk about some of the key people, like the key Palestinians speaking out in Sheikh Jarrah, a lot of what was coming out was because they were playing it on live. They were posting on social media, and there were times where Israel would purposely, like, they were getting their accounts shut down constantly. So it just showed you the power of social media. Okay, and then to wrap it up, and today, because I'm trying to finish, I'm gonna go maybe just a few minutes late to get us done, but then brings us to the ongoing Nakba, which is in the present. So now So prior to October 2023, there was an escalation under Israel's far-right government. So Benjamin Netanyahu returned to power as the prime minister, and he was part of the far-right government movement. And ultra-nationalists, like, which you probably, if you're following the news today, you'll hear the names of Ben Gvir and Smotrich. And they all call for, and they continue to do this, to call for violence against Palestinians in the West Bank and throughout Palestine, and to escalate their violence. Like both have like they do think like they've stormed the Aqsa, they have encouraged settlers to attack Palestinians, and so on. They also facilitated the increase in 2023 of settler expansions. So they continue to evict in East Jerusalem, as well as displacement in a town called Masafar Yatta. And I mentioned this before, but this resulted in the largest expansion of settlements in the past 20 years. And it also, under this government, we also saw, besides Gaza, of course, the Jenin assault. So that happened in 2023. There was a big assault, and then this past month, you see a major assault in Jenin, where Palestinians are getting killed, and the refugee camps are being bulldozed and destroyed, and homes are being demolished. I'm not gonna play this because of time. Okay. Okay. So is it okay? Okay, actually, I'm gonna ask, is it okay if I go 5 minutes over? And if you have to go, I understand, but I just wanna, there's only a few slides left. So I'm just gonna go finish these. If you can stay, if not, I completely understand. But I'm not gonna play this. This is just a video just to show you the cyclical nature of the assaults. And it talks about how much Gaza has been the siege on Gaza started in 2005, and the attacks have been happening. So the genocide is the most intense and the longest lasting, but this is not new. It keeps happening, and this has all been a buildup. Again, it's not in a vacuum. This has all been happening. And these.
This is
Okay, so these just show you, it's just a good comparison of diagrams. I think you can look at it more at your convenience later, but it just shows you, again, the systematic Nakba. This is a good diagram to compare. You see images from 1948 and then you see it in the present from 2017 and on to today. And then international advocacy and challenges. So again, we're here now to bring us to today in 2024. And we were just talking about this today at PAC, as horrible and as violent and as extreme as Israel has gone in its genocide on Gaza, this is also the first time we see such a large scale global awareness for Palestine. So the global participation in the BDS campaigns in the past year, in divestment, in the call for BDS, in so many people, so many companies that are pulling out of Israeli settlements and funding. The Palestinian narrative is gaining traction in the media. Western governments are now finally, they're being challenged for their support of Israel for the first time. All of this is happening. I'm sorry, the awareness, the awareness is growing, but at the same time, and there's also hope in the fact that we see all these solidarity movements, so including Black Lives Matter and many others. There's also a renewed focus on grassroots mobilization and Palestinian self-determination, but there is still challenges to that. So, for example, the Western governments, like the US and the EU, they maintain their support. Sorry, I misread this. They maintain their support for Israel, whereas many other countries on a global scale are starting to give pushback against Israel, and the UN as well. If you hear, there's a lot of being pushback. The problem is these key Western governments are still maintaining support, but we do see a lot of change that you didn't see just a few years ago. There's also a lot of criminalization that's been happening in pro-Palestinian activism. So like just a few days ago, a big activist, Ali Abu Nama, went for a conference in Switzerland. They allowed him to enter the country, and then they detained and arrested him for a few days until they released him, and then sent him to Turkey. So he was just going for a conference. He's a scholar. So I think it's a big balance of, we're seeing the world wake up, and I think that Israel, the power that Israel has it's waning. Their control of the narrative is waning. So there, and we're seeing a lot of global awareness, and I think it goes back to this class. Just all of you being here and being aware and trying to learn more is also a big sign of this. And then to turn it back to yesterday. So yesterday, as part of the ceasefire agreement, Palestinians were finally allowed to return north. So the north of Gaza, many Palestinians in the beginning of the genocide were being told, so we said there's this displacement, that they keep being moved. They keep being told you have to go to a safe place, and they keep trying, they're basically have been trying to push them out of Gaza. So Palestinians did not give up, and I do want to end us with this last video because it's a beautiful image of just mass return.
They have waited for this day for so very long. Forcibly displaced for 15 months, they have lost virtually everything. Tens of thousands now walking north, making their way back to whatever is left of their homes.
We want to see our family. I want to see my mum and dad. We haven't seen them for 15 months. It's a long time. We're going now.
I haven't seen my family for a year and a half. I want to go back and see them. I've been waiting for 3 days to go to my parents. We are tired. I want to go to Gaza. We're not coming back here.
Moments of joy, despite the hell they have suffered being far from over. They know there is very little to return to.
All of it, but so this is a really powerful scene and a powerful incident, and I honestly think this is going to go down in history in history. And I think one really powerful way of explaining it is, and this is by Jihad Abu Salim, who has actually spoken with PAC before. He said return is an image, return is a precedent, return is a process that reverses another, the Nakba. So if you remember all those images we talk about from 48 and from 67 and so on, of Palestinians being forced on foot to, by Israel, they were displaced, they were forced out of their homes, and here they are, thousands of Palestinians returning to their homes in North Gaza after 15 months of war, of Israeli violence and Israeli genocide and forced displacement. And despite knowing that they're coming back to rubble, to displacement, this Thursday we're having a talk, and someone who is joining me for that is Inas, and she's from North Gaza, and she was showing me pictures of her home today. And if you see the photos inside, it's all destroyed, but she said, I'm so happy our home is there. Like, our house is there, and we're gonna fix it, and we're gonna rebuild. And my family went back today, and they're gonna start working on it. And she was so happy. She said, I'm so happy because our home is there, and there's my room, and there's our house, and I know what it all is. It was all destroyed from the inside, but she's like, but I know this is my home, and I'm coming, and it's what I'm gonna go back to. So
But like,
with that, we'll end. We'll remind you of the survey next week, but that brings us to the end of today's class. Next week, we're going to talk about how to counter Zionist myths, and we'll be having guests from USCPR joining us. I know I went over, but I appreciate you all staying. And I see a lot of messages that I wasn't catching up to, but if anyone has any last questions or thoughts, as always, this will all be posted. It'll all be posted, the recording will be posted, the slides will be posted, and we hope to see you all next week. And thank you all for joining tonight. If you have any questions, you could say it in the chat or just shout it out loud before you go. Thank you, everyone.